The morning sun barely broke through the thick dust clouds hanging over the small Afghan village. Marine Corporal Sarah Martinez crouched behind a crumbling mud wall, her heart pounding as bullets whizzed overhead. She had been in combat zones before, but nothing like this. What started as a routine patrol had turned into a nightmare when their convoy was ambushed just outside the village. Sarah's squad of 8 Marines had been separated during the initial attack. 3 of her teammates were wounded and taking cover in a nearby building, while the others had retreated to establish a defensive perimeter. She found herself alone, pinned down by enemy fire coming from multiple directions. The Taliban fighters had them surrounded and escape seemed impossible. Her radio crackled with desperate calls for backup, but the nearest reinforcements were still hours away. The enemy had chosen their ambush site perfectly, a narrow valley with high ground on all sides, making it nearly impossible for helicopters to land safely. Sarah checked her ammunition and felt her stomach drop. She had maybe 30 rounds left, enough for a few more minutes of fighting at most. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her freeze. Someone was moving closer to her position. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. She could hear voices speaking in a language she didn't understand, getting louder with each passing second. Her hands trembled as she gripped her rifle, knowing that if they found her hiding spot, she would have to fight with everything she had. A shadow appeared at the edge of her vision. One of the enemy fighters had climbed onto a nearby rooftop and was scanning the area below. Sarah held her breath, praying he wouldn't spot her. The minutes felt like hours as she waited, listening to the ongoing firefight echoing through the valley. Her wounded teammates were still calling for help over the radio, but she couldn't reach them without exposing herself to enemy fire. The fighter on the roof suddenly pointed in her direction and shouted something to his companions. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized they had found her. Within seconds, bullets began striking the wall just inches from her head, sending chunks of dried mud flying in all directions. She had no choice but to return fire, even though it meant revealing her exact position to every enemy in the area. As she fired her last few rounds, Sarah saw more fighters moving to surround her position. They were closing in from 3 different directions, and she was almost out of ammunition. The situation was hopeless, but she refused to give up. She thought about her family back home, about the oath she had sworn to protect her fellow Marines, and about the villagers who were caught in the middle of this battle. The firing suddenly stopped. An eerie silence fell over the valley, broken only by the sound of Sarah's heavy breathing and the distant moans of the wounded. She peered around the edge of the wall and saw at least a dozen enemy fighters moving methodically through the rubble, searching every hiding spot. They knew she was trapped, and they were taking their time to find her. Sarah's hands shook as she ejected her empty magazine and reached for her last one. Only 15 rounds remained between her and capture. She had heard the stories about what happened to captured female soldiers, and she was determined not to let that be her fate. If this was going to be her last stand, she would make it count. The sound of boots on stone grew louder as the enemy fighters drew closer to her position. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, said a silent prayer, and prepared for what might be her final battle. She had been trained for situations like this, but training could never fully prepare someone for the reality of facing death alone in a hostile land, thousands of miles from home. Unknown to Sarah, high above on a distant ridge, someone was watching the entire scene unfold through a powerful scope. Navy SEAL sniper Jake Thompson had been tracking the enemy movement for the past hour, waiting for the right moment to act. He had seen Sarah's desperate fight and knew she was running out of time and ammunition. Jake had been operating alone in the mountains for 3 days, gathering intelligence on enemy positions when he heard the sounds of the ambush. As a sniper, his job was usually to remain hidden and report what he saw. But watching a fellow service member fight for her life changed everything. He began moving closer to the valley, knowing that one person with the right skills and equipment might be able to turn the tide of this desperate battle. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, but so did the desperation of the enemy fighters. They knew that once air support arrived, their chance of victory would disappear. Sarah could see them gathering for what appeared to be a final coordinated assault from 3 different directions. Through her scope, she counted at least 8 fighters positioning themselves for the attack. Jake was down to his last magazine for his sidearm, and Sarah had only 4 precious rounds left in the sniper rifle. "They're going to rush us all at once," Jake observed, watching the enemy movements through his binoculars. Once they start moving, we'll have maybe 30 seconds before they overrun our position. Make every shot perfect. The first wave came from the right side. 3 fighters sprinting across open ground, firing as they ran. Sarah tracked the lead runner through her scope, leading him slightly to account for his movement. Her shot caught him center mass and he tumbled to the ground. The other 2 immediately changed direction, making themselves harder targets. Jake engaged the left flank with his pistol, but the range was too great for accurate fire with a handgun. 2 more enemy fighters were advancing from that direction, using covering fire from their companions to mask their approach. Sarah swung her rifle toward them and took her second shot, but the target dropped behind cover just as she fired, and the bullet struck stone instead of flesh. The helicopters were getting closer, but not close enough. Enemy fighters from the center position began their assault, knowing they had only moments before air support changed the battle completely. Sarah could see 5 fighters moving toward them in a coordinated advance, using smoke grenades and suppressing fire to cover their approach. With only 2 rounds left, Sarah had to make impossible choices about which targets posed the greatest threat. Jake was doing his best with his sidearm, but the pistol's limited range meant the enemy could advance fairly close before he could engage effectively. "The one with the rocket launcher," Jake shouted, pointing toward a fighter carrying what looked like an RPG. "Take him first." Sarah found the target through her scope and took a deep breath. The fighter was moving erratically, making the shot extremely difficult. She waited for a moment when his movement pattern would bring him into a clear shooting lane, then squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect and the rocket launcher fell silent. But now she had only 1 round left and multiple enemies were still advancing. The lead helicopter finally came into view, but it was still several hundred yards away and couldn't engage the enemies who were too close to Sarah and Jake's position. The pilot's voice came through Jake's radio. "Friendlies, mark your position with smoke. We can't engage until we know exactly where you are." Jake grabbed a smoke grenade from his gear and threw it near their position, creating a purple cloud that would identify them to the helicopter crew. But the same smoke that marked them as friendlies also obscured Sarah's vision through the scope. She could no longer clearly see the approaching enemies, and her last shot would have to be taken on instinct rather than precision. 3 enemy fighters emerged from the smoke, less than 50 yards away and closing fast. Jake engaged with his pistol, managing to wound one but not stop the advance. Sarah tried to track the remaining targets through the swirling smoke, but the scope that had been such an advantage at long range was now a limitation in close quarters combat. "Switch to iron sights," Jake yelled, but Sarah had never trained with the backup sighting system on the sniper rifle. The weapon felt completely different without the scope, and she struggled to acquire targets through the simple metal sights. The advancing enemies were now close enough that she could see their faces clearly. Jake's pistol ran dry and he drew his combat knife, preparing for hand-to-hand combat. One of the enemy fighters raised his rifle toward Sarah, and she knew this was her last chance. Without the scope to rely on, she had to trust her basic marksmanship training and her instincts. She aimed at the largest target and fired her final round. The shot took down the closest enemy fighter, but 2 more were still advancing. Jake tackled one of them, and they fell to the ground in a violent struggle for the fighter's weapon. Sarah was left facing the last enemy with an empty rifle, and no other weapon within reach. The fighter smiled as he realized her ammunition was gone, and began to raise his own rifle for the killing shot. That's when the helicopter's door gunner finally had a clear shot. The heavy machine gun opened fire, and the remaining enemy fighters either fell or fled toward the surrounding hills. The immediate threat was over, but Sarah and Jake were both wounded and exhausted from the intense battle. As medical personnel fast-roped down from the helicopter, Sarah looked at the sniper rifle that had saved both their lives. In the space of 20 minutes, she had learned to use a weapon she had never touched before, making shots that would have challenged experienced marksmen. Jake sat beside her, also staring at the rifle with something like wonder. "I've never seen anyone learn to shoot like that under pressure," Jake said, as medics began treating their wounds. "You didn't just use the rifle, you became one with it." Sarah was still processing what had happened, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She had discovered abilities she never knew she possessed, but the cost had been higher than she ever imagined. The helicopter crew reported that all of Sarah's Marine teammates had been successfully evacuated and were receiving medical treatment. The mission that had started as a routine patrol had become a legend that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. But for Sarah and Jake, it was just the beginning of a partnership that would change both of their careers forever. Sarah stared at the massive sniper rifle in disbelief. The weapon was unlike anything she had ever handled, longer, heavier, and more complex than her standard Marine rifle. "I don't know how to use this," she said, her voice barely audible over the approaching enemy voices. Jake grabbed her shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. "You're about to learn," he said with calm confidence that somehow made her believe it was possible. Jake quickly explained the basics while bullets flew overhead. "This rifle fires one shot at a time, but each shot counts for 10 of yours," he said, showing her the bolt action mechanism. "The scope is already zeroed for 400 yards. See that red dot? Put it on the target and squeeze the trigger slowly." Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted the heavy weapon, struggling to find a comfortable shooting position. The first enemy fighter appeared around a corner, moving cautiously toward their position. "Take your time," Jake whispered. "Control your breathing. This weapon is more forgiving than you think." Sarah adjusted her grip and tried to remember everything she had learned about marksmanship in basic training. The scope's magnification made everything look closer but also harder to track as her hands shook with adrenaline. Sarah's first shot missed completely, the bullet striking a wall several feet from her intended target. "Too fast on the trigger," Jake said calmly, as if they weren't in a life-or-death situation. "The rifle wants to hit the target. Let it do its job." The enemy fighter had taken cover after hearing the shot, but Sarah could see part of his shoulder exposed behind a wooden crate. Her second shot was better, splintering the wood near the target but still not making contact. Jake noticed that Sarah was fighting the rifle instead of working with it. "Stop trying to control everything," he advised. "Find your natural point of aim and let your body relax into the shot." It was advice that seemed impossible to follow while under enemy fire, but Sarah tried to calm her racing heart. The third shot found its mark. The enemy fighter spun and fell, and Sarah felt a mixture of relief and shock at the power of the weapon. "That's it," Jake said with approval. "Now you understand what this rifle can do." But there was no time to celebrate. More enemy fighters were moving into position, and they could hear voices shouting commands in the distance. Jake used his sidearm to provide covering fire, while Sarah worked the bolt action mechanism to load another round. The motion felt awkward and slow compared to her automatic rifle, but she was beginning to appreciate the precision that came with each carefully aimed shot. "Remember, make every shot count," Jake said as he changed his own magazine. "We don't have unlimited ammunition." Two more enemy fighters appeared simultaneously from different directions, trying to flank their position. Sarah had to choose her target quickly, while Jake engaged the other with his pistol. She selected the closer threat and took her shot, watching through the scope as the fighter stumbled and fell. The distant one immediately took cover, having learned to respect the sniper rifle's deadly accuracy. Jake was impressed by how quickly Sarah was adapting to the weapon. Most people needed weeks of training to become proficient with a precision rifle, but she was learning to use it effectively in combat within minutes. "You're a natural," he told her as they repositioned to get a better angle on the remaining enemies. "Have you ever done any competitive shooting?" Sarah shook her head, focused on scanning for targets through the powerful scope. She had only fired weapons during military training, but something about the sniper rifle felt right in her hands. The weight and precision demanded respect and concentration, forcing her to slow down and think about each shot instead of spraying bullets and hoping for the best. The enemy fighters had learned to be more cautious after losing several of their number to the sniper fire. They were using better cover and coordinating their movements more carefully. But this also made them more predictable, and Sarah was beginning to anticipate where they would appear next. She found herself thinking like a sniper, looking for the perfect shot instead of just reacting to threats. A group of 3 fighters tried to rush their position from the left side, thinking they could overwhelm the defenders with speed and numbers. Sarah tracked the lead fighter through her scope and fired just as he reached the open space between 2 buildings. The shot dropped him instantly, causing the other 2 to dive for cover and abandon their assault. Jake realized that their situation was improving, but they were still outnumbered and surrounded. The enemy fighters were regrouping and would likely try a coordinated attack from multiple directions. "We need to think about getting out of here," he told Sarah as she worked the bolt to chamber another round. That helicopter support your unit called for should be arriving soon. Sarah nodded but kept her eye to the scope, searching for targets. She had found a rhythm with the weapon and felt more confident with each shot. The rifle had become an extension of her will, allowing her to reach out and touch enemies who thought they were safely hidden. For the first time since the ambush began, she felt like they had a real chance of survival. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance brought hope, but also urgency. The enemy fighters would likely make one final desperate attempt to eliminate the American forces before air support arrived. Sarah checked her ammunition and realized she had only 4 rounds left in the rifle. Whatever happened next would test everything she had learned in the past few minutes about precision shooting under extreme pressure. Jake Thompson moved like a ghost through the rocky terrain, his years of SEAL training evident in every silent step. He had spotted Sarah's position and counted at least 15 enemy fighters closing in on her location. Time was running out, and he knew that a direct assault would be suicide. But Jake had something the enemy didn't expect: the element of surprise and one of the most advanced sniper rifles in the military. From his new position on an overlooking ridge, Jake could see the entire battlefield spread out below him. Sarah was trapped behind a low wall with nowhere to run, while enemy fighters moved through the village like hunters tracking wounded prey. He adjusted his scope and began calculating distances, wind speed, and elevation. His first shot would have to be perfect because once he opened fire, every enemy in the valley would know exactly where he was. Jake's radio came alive with chatter from the Marine unit's desperate calls for backup. He listened as Sarah's voice broke through the static, reporting her ammunition status to her commanding officer. "Down to my last magazine," she said, her voice steady despite the hopeless situation. Jake felt a surge of respect for the young Marine's courage. She wasn't giving up even when facing impossible odds. The first enemy fighter appeared around the corner of Sarah's hiding spot, his rifle raised and ready. Jake's finger found the trigger, and his breathing slowed to match his heartbeat. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, and the enemy fighter dropped instantly. Before the others could react, Jake had already shifted his aim and fired again. 2 down, but more than a dozen remained. Chaos erupted in the valley as the enemy fighters scrambled to find cover and locate the source of the sniper fire. Sarah used the confusion to change positions, moving to a better defensive spot while the enemy was distracted. She still didn't know who was helping her, but she was grateful for the unexpected assistance. Jake continued his deadly work, picking off enemy fighters one by one as they exposed themselves trying to reach Sarah's position. His years of training had taught him patience and precision, but this was different. Usually he had hours or even days to plan the perfect shot. Now he was fighting against time, knowing that Sarah's ammunition wouldn't last much longer. The enemy fighters began to adapt to the sniper threat, using smoke grenades and staying behind solid cover as they advanced. Jake realized that his long-range support could only do so much. Sarah was still trapped, and more enemy reinforcements were arriving from the surrounding hills. He made a decision that went against everything he had been taught about sniper operations. He was going to leave his overwatch position and get closer to the action. Jake packed his gear and began moving down the mountainside toward the village. It was incredibly dangerous to leave his sniper's nest, but he could see that Sarah's situation was becoming more desperate by the minute. Several enemy fighters had found positions where his rifle couldn't reach them, and they were slowly working their way closer to her location. As he moved through the rocky terrain, Jake could hear the intensity of the firefight increasing. Sarah was down to short, controlled bursts of gunfire, trying to make every bullet count. The enemy fighters were getting bolder, knowing that she was running low on ammunition. Some of them had even started standing up and moving in the open, confident that she couldn't hit them all. Jake reached the edge of the village and took cover behind an abandoned truck. From this new position, he could see Sarah clearly for the first time. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her early 20s, but she fought with the skill and determination of a seasoned veteran. Her uniform was torn and dirty, and he could see blood on her left arm where shrapnel had found its mark. The enemy fighters were now less than 50 yards from Sarah's position and closing fast. Jake knew that his sniper rifle, while deadly accurate, wasn't designed for the close-quarters battle that was about to unfold. But Sarah's weapon was almost empty, and she would need something with more firepower to survive what was coming next. That's when Jake made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of continuing to provide sniper support from a distance, he began moving toward Sarah's position. He had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane, but it was the only chance either of them had of getting out of this valley alive. Jake sprinted across an open area, drawing enemy fire as he dove for cover near Sarah's position. She spun around, raising her rifle before recognizing the American uniform and equipment. "Who are you?" she shouted over the sound of gunfire. "SEAL sniper," Jake replied, already assessing their situation. "And we're about to try something that's never been done before." The enemy fighters were now close enough that Jake could hear their voices calling to each other as they coordinated their final assault. Sarah's rifle clicked empty, and she looked at Jake with a mixture of hope and desperation. "I'm out," she said simply. That's when Jake did something that would change both of their lives forever. He handed her his precision sniper rifle, a weapon she had never fired before, and prepared to teach her how to use it in the middle of a firefight. 2 years later, Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez crouched on a rooftop in Syria, her eye pressed to the scope of her customized sniper rifle. Below her, Jake Thompson led a team of special operations soldiers through the narrow streets of a war-torn city. Their mission was to rescue American hostages held by terrorists, and Sarah's job was to provide overwatch and eliminate any threats that endangered the rescue team. The experimental program had exceeded everyone's expectations. Sarah had not only completed the intensive training, but had graduated at the top of her class. She had become part of an elite unit that operated in the gray areas between traditional military roles, sometimes acting as snipers, sometimes as assault troops, always adapting to whatever the mission required. Through her scope, Sarah watched as Jake's team approached the building where intelligence indicated the hostages were being held. She had clear sightlines on 3 enemy positions that could threaten the rescue operation. Her role was to remain invisible until the moment her shots were needed, then deliver precision fire that would save American lives. The past 2 years had transformed Sarah from a regular Marine into one of the most skilled precision marksmen in the military. She had operated in 12 different countries, always working with small teams on missions that never appeared in newspapers. Her partnership with Jake had evolved from instructor-student to equals who trusted each other completely. The rescue operation began exactly as planned. Jake's team breached the building's ground floor while Sarah maintained surveillance from above. Through her radio, she could hear the controlled chaos of close-quarters combat as the team fought their way toward the hostages. Her job was to ensure that no enemy reinforcements reached the building. 2 vehicles approached from the east, filled with armed fighters responding to the sound of gunfire. Sarah's first shot disabled the lead vehicle's engine, causing it to coast to a stop. Her second shot eliminated the driver of the following vehicle, which crashed into a concrete barrier. The enemy reinforcements were neutralized before they could reach the battle. From her elevated position, Sarah could see the entire tactical situation unfolding. Jake's team had located the hostages but were pinned down by enemy fire from an upper floor. Traditional support weapons couldn't be used without risking the lives of the Americans being held captive. This was exactly the kind of scenario that the experimental program had been designed to address. Sarah shifted her position and found a narrow angle where she could see into the building through a damaged wall. An enemy fighter was preparing to throw a grenade down the stairs toward Jake's team. The shot would be extremely difficult, a moving target partially concealed by debris, with American lives depending on split-second precision. Sarah controlled her breathing and allowed her training to take over. The rifle seemed to aim itself as she tracked the target's movement pattern. When the enemy fighter raised his arm to throw the grenade, Sarah's shot found its mark. The grenade fell harmlessly to the floor as the threat was eliminated. Jake's voice came through her radio. "Outstanding shot. Moving to extract the hostages now." The rescue was completed successfully, but Sarah remained in position to cover the team's withdrawal. As Jake's team moved through the streets with the rescued hostages, she continued to scan for threats from her overwatch position. 3 more enemy fighters appeared on a distant rooftop, setting up what looked like a rocket launcher aimed at the extraction route. Sarah's shots eliminated all 3 targets before they could fire their weapon. The rescued hostages and Jake's team reached the extraction helicopter safely, but Sarah's work wasn't finished. She had to cover the helicopter's departure and then make her own escape from the enemy-controlled city. As the helicopter disappeared into the distance, Sarah packed her rifle and began moving toward her own extraction point. The mission had been a complete success, with all hostages rescued and no American casualties. It was the kind of operation that validated everything the experimental program had tried to achieve. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a promotion board as she was advanced to gunnery sergeant. The experimental program had been made permanent, and she had been selected to help train the next generation of precision marksmen. Jake, now promoted to chief petty officer, would continue to work with her as they developed new tactics and techniques. During the promotion ceremony, Sarah thought back to that desperate day in Afghanistan when Jake had placed his sniper rifle in her hands. Neither of them could have imagined that moment would lead to a completely new approach to military operations. The program they had helped create was now being copied by Allied forces around the world. After the ceremony, Jake found Sarah on the base's firing range, where she was testing a new rifle design. "Any regrets about leaving your old Marine unit?" he asked. Sarah lined up a shot at a target 800 yards away and squeezed the trigger. The bullet found its mark perfectly, just as it always did. "No regrets," Sarah said as she worked the bolt to chamber another round. "Sometimes you have to be willing to try something completely new to discover what you're really capable of." She handed Jake the rifle so he could test it too. "Besides, we make a pretty good team." Jake took the rifle and smiled. "The best," he agreed. "Now let's see if this new design is as accurate as you are." As he settled into shooting position, both of them knew that their partnership would continue to evolve and adapt, just like the rifles they used and the missions they undertook. The story that had begun with a desperate fight for survival had become a legendary partnership that changed military tactics forever. Sarah Martinez had proven that sometimes the most unlikely people can achieve extraordinary things when given the right opportunity and the courage to seize it. The rifle that Jake had placed in her hands during their darkest moment had become the key to both of their futures. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a military hospital in Germany, her wounded arm wrapped in bandages but healing well. She had expected to return to her regular Marine unit once she recovered, but instead she found herself in a meeting with Colonel Matthews, a gruff officer she had never seen before. Beside him sat Jake Thompson, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform instead of combat gear. "Corporal Martinez," the colonel began, "what happened in that valley has gotten attention all the way up to the Pentagon. A Marine learning to use a precision rifle in combat and making expert-level shots under extreme pressure. That's not something that happens every day." Sarah shifted in her chair, unsure where this conversation was heading. Jake spoke up for the first time. "Sir, with respect, what happened out there wasn't luck. Sarah has natural abilities that I've never seen before. She adapted to that rifle faster than snipers who have trained for months." The colonel nodded and opened a thick folder on his desk. "Which is why we're offering you an opportunity, Corporal." The opportunity was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. The military was forming a new experimental unit that would combine traditional Marine infantry skills with advanced sniper training. They wanted Sarah to be one of the first candidates for the program, working directly with experienced SEAL snipers to develop new tactics and techniques. "The program is voluntary," Colonel Matthews explained, "but if you accept, you'll be working with some of the best shooters in the world. The training will be intense. 6 months of advanced marksmanship, fieldcraft, and specialized operations. Not everyone who starts the program finishes it." Sarah looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. The decision meant leaving everything familiar behind. Sarah's Marine unit was like a family to her, and the idea of starting over with strangers was intimidating. But she couldn't forget the feeling of that sniper rifle in her hands, or the lives that had been saved because she learned to use it effectively. "What would my role be in this new unit?" she asked. Jake answered this time. "You would be trained as a precision marksman, but with a twist. Instead of operating alone like traditional snipers, you would work as part of a team that can adapt to different situations. Sometimes you would provide long-range support. Other times you would work in close quarters. It's a completely new approach to military operations." Sarah thought about her teammates who had been wounded in the ambush. They were all recovering, but the experience had changed everyone involved. The traditional ways of fighting weren't always enough when facing determined enemies who knew the terrain and had nothing to lose. Maybe new approaches were exactly what the military needed. "I'll do it," Sarah said finally. Colonel Matthews smiled for the first time during the meeting. "Outstanding. Your training begins in 2 weeks at a classified location in North Carolina. Sergeant Thompson will be one of your instructors. Sarah looked at Jake with surprise. She hadn't known he would be part of the program, too. After the colonel left, Jake and Sarah walked through the hospital corridors together. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked. "The training is going to be harder than anything you've experienced. Most of the other candidates will be men who have been in special operations for years. You'll be starting from a different place than they are." Sarah thought about his question carefully. The safe choice would be to return to her regular unit and continue her military career on a predictable path. But the events in that Afghan valley had shown her capabilities she never knew existed. "I'm sure," she said. "But I want to know, why did you recommend me for this program?" Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because in all my years as a SEAL sniper, I've never seen anyone with your instincts. You didn't just learn to use that rifle. You became a different person when you held it. That's not something that can be taught. It's something you either have or you don't, and you have it." The next 2 weeks passed quickly as Sarah recovered from her injuries and prepared for the new training program. She read everything she could find about precision shooting and studied videos of expert marksmen, but she also spent time thinking about what had really happened in that valley and why she had been able to perform so well under pressure. When she arrived at the training facility in North Carolina, Sarah was nervous but determined. The other candidates were exactly what Jake had described: experienced special operations soldiers who had volunteered for the experimental program. She was the only woman and the only regular Marine in a group of hardened warriors. The training began immediately with weapons familiarization. Sarah was introduced to rifles she had only seen in magazines, each one more precise and powerful than anything in standard military inventory. But when she picked up the same model of sniper rifle that Jake had handed her in Afghanistan, something clicked into place. On the firing range, Sarah's performance amazed even the experienced instructors. Her shots were consistently accurate at distances that challenged seasoned marksmen. Other candidates who had been skeptical about having a regular Marine in the program began to take notice. Whatever had happened in that Afghan valley, it hadn't been a fluke. Jake watched from the instructor's platform as Sarah worked through increasingly difficult shooting scenarios. She was proving that their decision to recommend her for the program had been correct, but he also knew that marksmanship was only one part of what she would need to learn. The real test would come when they moved beyond target shooting to tactical scenarios where lives would depend on her skills. As Sarah packed her rifle case after the first day of training, she felt a confidence she had never experienced before. The weapon that had seemed so foreign in that desperate firefight now felt like a natural extension of her abilities. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do.